Is the sound all right? You can hear me all right? Is it a bit echoey? A little bit. Okay. Is that all right now? Okay. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. The chief argument for this last talk is that much of what we call or experience as architecture is actually in the detail. And the context for the argument is that the world that we currently inhabit puts much more emphasis on the whole and on the idea or the performance, on the broad spatial and formal manipulation of a building. And of course, that's clearly part of our experience of architecture too. But it's far from penetrating architecture's potential for meaning and for depth. So since the beginnings of modernism, there's been this gradual erosion of detail, depleting it. And I think there have been two kinds of reduction. The first one is a kind of carelessness, a simple result of profit motive. The more simplistic a building and the greater the use of standardized components of construction, the cheaper. So it's simply eliminating detail because it's cheaper not to have it. And the second is a kind of ideological reduction, because this quest for the new rational architecture of the beginnings of the 20th century, which had to be free from all the baggage of the past, the very idea of ornament was a bad one. In fact, it was seen to be something degenerate. There was a famous essay called "Ornament and Crime." So, if you're looking for a clear, rational, new, pure architecture of the new age, you don't want ornaments in the or detail in the way that architecture's always had it before. You want a clean, fresh, pure beginning. So there was a kind of ideological getting rid of the idea of detail. And if something was to be modern, it had to be smooth and streamlined and shiny. So now, today, because this has continued really right up to today to quite a large extent with some forays into reclaiming detail in certain areas for certain times, but it still does move right up to today. What's meant by detail today when people talk about it is the drawings, the details, what you need to enable a builder to price a building and to build it, which is a bit different from the idea of detail that I will be talking about, and that architecture has always held. And in fact, today the drawings for details are very often done by somebody different from the person who designed the building. And in fact, they could be done in another part of the world. There was a period, I don't know if it's still true, but when quite a lot of South African architects, when there wasn't very much work around, were doing the details for buildings that came from the UK or from America. So the details were something completely separate from the building. And a lot of them come out of standards, out of a catalogue on a computer. Can you imagine if the details of people's faces came out of a computer? It's small wonder that you get this kind of dumbing down of architecture, isn't it, when you think of it like that? So today, with this great concentration on unique and extraordinary form, in a lot of buildings the idea of detail is almost completely absent, like with this yacht club of Chipperfields in Valencia. However close you get to it, it looks the same. And again, what does that mean? It's a ghost building, isn't it? If you want to make yourself into a ghost, you eliminate any form of detail. You put a white thing over your head and you cut little eyes so there's no sign of any difference, of any distinguishing character in you. So it ranges from that, much of today, to that which is rather similar. Very extraordinary kind of overall form, but almost no detail at all. There's no connection between the building and the sky or the edge or the ground other than a gap. And and between windows and walls, there's no detail at all. The only detail really is in the surface. Or you get a kind of glitzy cosmetic overlay in parts of it. Or I'm giving poor old Louis Vuitton Foundation a bit of a hard time this week. This very dramatic building of Frank Gehry's, which on the outside looks, very interesting and beautifully made and beautifully thought through. By the way, it's incredibly expensive. All the glass is specially made curved glass to work at those curves. And this building, which is not a big building at all, cost 1.2 billion rand. Incredibly expensive. But if you look at the detail of it on the right, and he seems to expose it quite freely, but it also reminds me of a fancy dress. You're a ghost on one hand, or you some other kind of creature on the other, and you spend before you set off to the fancy dress, you spend a lot of time putting very rapidly together something that on the surface looks like some kind of extraordinary creature, but underneath it's just a chaos. Do you know that sort of? Have you had that sort of experience? And if you look, oops, getting caught up here. If you look in the right-hand side, look at where those structural members hit the surface. It's completely random. It's what I call a hodgepodge. Whereas in historical buildings, pre-modern buildings, the detail of the building is absolutely integral with the whole. You can't visualize the building really without the detail. They're one and the same thing. So in this talk I'm going to go through a process of examining the role of detail in carrying meaning and in shaping and giving character and affecting the experience of buildings. And I'll be using quite a few of the same categories of thinking about meaning and building that I have previously. But the first issue is simply identification. Once you have a basic kind of building, and you recognize that, it's almost entirely through detail that you identify differences between one and the next. But I think it's fairly obvious that from childhood to adulthood, we start to construct our world through differentiating one phenomenon from another. You start off with cat, dog, person, and that's a sort of adequate differentiation to start with, different particular phenomena. But then as you grow older, you identify different kinds of dogs, one from the other, by their details as a little human being growing up. So I think that's fairly obvious through a mixture of the sameness of things, of types of things, and the details that they have. You construct your understanding of the world, and if you don't have that, you can't really exist in the world without that balance between differences and samenesses. So, for instance, how do you identify that set of mountains? Where is it? It's the Cederberg, and you can see it immediately if you've been to the Cederberg, because you look at the detail of it and you see the way all these little rocks stand around on end, these pieces of sandstone, which I keep getting caught up, sorry, which is quite different from that, where the details are quite different. And if you want to find your way around that piece of the Drakensberg, what do you look for? You look for the details of the way that the buttresses come down, and that enables you to get there. The mountain range has a particular form, obviously as a totality, which is also part of your understanding of it. But, past that most broad thing of a wall of mountain, the next thing that gives you recognition really is the detail. And the same goes for tiny creatures on the Drakensberg. So I'm sure for most of you those are just butterflies, like they are for me. They're summer butterflies. But if you're a person who wants to know any more about the butterfly, you very quickly start to look at the details, how the ribs and the wings organized, how's the color organized, what's the proportion between the length of the body and the size of the wing, and so on and so on and so on. All those little details enable you to identify it clearly, and I think that's sort of fairly obvious. So when you look at a group of buildings like that, in a certain sense, they're all the same, aren't they? And what enables you to understand that one is an early Florentine a palace, and another one's from Venice, and the third one's a later one from Rome, and the fifth one is in Verona. It's a modern building, and you can see clearly that it's simply the detail that enables you to identify those differences. And so if you have streets of similar kinds of buildings, or canals of them like you do in Venice, you identify differences in those buildings that are all the same from their details. And if you don't have those differences, you have this kind of blur of sameness on the right-hand side. Monotone. Okay, so that's the first role, if you like, of detail. The second is that detail, more than buildings as wholes, conveys historical, cultural meaning and enables us to locate them in time and place. So on the left-hand side is a slither of building by Palladio. Palladio is apparently the most influential architect anywhere in the world ever, Palladio, in case you didn't know his name. So there's a piece of building, and you can see it, so just a slither. It's not the whole building at all. It's actually just two bays of what's clearly meant to be a much, much larger building. And but there's enough in that little slither to tell you an awful lot about the building. You can visualize its totality. The piece of detail tells you about something about the owner, about the form of dwelling that was commissioned. It's made in three parts. Very classical, the lower part connected with a square, the piano nobile, the sort of great living area, defined by those big columns, and then the sort of attic story up on the top. It tells you about the values of the architect and the person who built it, because it's clearly working in the Renaissance with a classical language. So it's a humanist who did it, and a humanist architect, and it tells you a lot about the technology. So there's a whole rich language of meaning that comes out of that little slither of a building. And it's really just coming out of the detail. So now I'm going to look at a few Palladian buildings, a few more of them, and show you how, or give you some sense of how the detail talks to you. So if we go to the right-hand side, there's the Basilica building, which is quite an early building of Palladio's, and as you see, 1546. And it's really a whole series of multiplication of the bay that you see there with the arch and the two little spaces on the side, some big two orders or sizes of columns, big ones and smaller ones, and then the arch form and the two round holes and next to the arch. Well, that's a motif that was developed by somebody called Serlio, and which he published, Serlio did, in 1537. So it was just 9 years before this building was built. So it just shows you exactly where Palladio was, right up to the minute, with the latest things that were coming out. While it is obviously also, through its detailing and the way that it's organized with the Tuscan, Roman Tuscan columns down below and the Ionic ones above, so it's also talking about antique history all at the same time. If you go to the Palazzo Tiene on the left-hand side, and if you look at this very what you call rustication, the sort of exaggeration of the stone lower down and around the windows and so on, that shows clearly where Palladio's been. He's been to Rome shortly before this, and he's looked at the work of Raphael there as an architect, and a man called Giulio Romano who worked with and for Raphael. And it shows also that he's visited Mantua, fairly close by to where this was built in. These are all in Vicenza. And because a lot of these things, these motifs that are developed in this building are very close to buildings that Giulio Romano had done in the Palazzo del Te in Mantua. So it again locates it very precisely in time, those details do. Although in a certain sense these buildings all look the same, the details tell you more than that. On the right-hand side, the way the building is organized, again in detail with a base and then these large columns taking it up to a big cornice, that way of detailing a facade comes again from Rome, directly from Bramante, who was one of the great explorers in the use of classical language in Renaissance architecture. The Palazzo Valmarana shows that he's also had a look in Rome at Michelangelo's buildings with this great big tall column elements in the surface and these very tight energetic spaces between them. It's just like Michelangelo's work on the Campidoglio or in St. Peter's. And then finally on the right-hand side, a late building of Palladio's where it's like his mature style, and there are all sorts of things that are going on there that we haven't got time to look at now, but that are derived from all that, but now he's kind of interpreting anew so that it's something that's recognizably his. So I hope that gives you some idea of, with the same kind of building, these palazzo buildings in Vicenza, and you can actually go there and just walk the streets, and they're all there, and all these stories you can learn out of the buildings, just out of their details. So it's like saying, just think about all that architecture, and it's all happening only within sort of a meter thickness of the outside wall. Now, Carlo Scarpa was brought up in Vicenza, in amongst all those sort of buildings, and others by people of similar period. And so when he comes to use this bank, which we've looked at very briefly before, he uses that palazzo form again. So you can see again it's got a base element in it, that middle element, the sort of old piano nobile element, and then the attic piece that runs along the top. Same differentiation into three. And although he talks about the same historical theme in certain respects as Palladio does, it obviously also refers to contemporary construction method and architectural syntax, and it does that through its details. So it's on the left-hand side, you can see that it's quite clearly that it's built in two layers. It's a little bit, it talks a lot about thinness, architectural thinness and lightness. So it's almost like showing the skirts that are hanging on the structure of the building. And on the right-hand side, you can see that that structure emerges out at the top. So it's exemplifying and very much a contemporary form of construction with columns taking loads and walls not having to take any loads. So it's talking a lot through its details about a contemporary construction within an overall form idea of that comes from history. And if you get more close to the details, you can see that he's looking for, in a contemporary way, the same kind of intensity of expression in the surface of the building, using these two layers of building against each other, the same kind of intensity as the classical buildings. And he's also working with similar forms to the old buildings. So he's working with moldings to act as elements that help deal with water running down the surface of the buildings in a very similar kind of a way to older structures. And even these round window forms are things that are referring to history. So you can see that there's a lot that's going on there that he's referring to, both historical and constructional, and almost all of it is coming out of the way that it's made in detail. Now I want to divert a little bit from this line of talking just to bring up another issue, and that is around where architectural detail occurs mostly. And it happens mainly, I'm coming back also to this Palladian building, the Basilica building. It happens at the junctions between inside and out, between the building and the ground, and at the joints between materials or elements in the buildings. A writer on this, Mario Frascati, called these two kinds of joints as a kind of the fertile ground for communication in architecture. Formal joints, that is the sort of spatial joints, like a porch stuck onto the front of a building would be a spatial joint, and material joints when these different elements in a building's facade or in parts of building where they come together. So if we look at the Basilica building there, I think that those two kinds of joints are quite clear, and the formal joint is really in the thickness of the element itself. But let's just move on and look at the material joint. So this is that typical bay again, and you can see every time anything touches anything else, there's a bit of detail. When the building hits the ground, there's three steps. Where the column hits the floor, there's a base. Where the column hits the beam, there's a little bit of a performance. And in the capital itself, there's also a whole lot of little performances, and so on in the little beam above it. It itself has got quite a lot of detail in it. And then if you look at the arch, where the arch hits the next level of corners, there's that little face, that figure that sticks out there, that that's where the detail happens. And if you just visualize any of those not being there, it would be something very different, wouldn't it? So it's at all those junctions, all those joints, that's where it's all happening, really. And the building, in many ways, is simply a multiplication of that element. But it's also got this sort of formal joint aspect of it, which is here seen in the depth between inside and out. So, and I think that this shows you how he kind of celebrates that depth of the double column and then all the little details that happen around it. And then where the building meets the sky, it changes. So you have a big cornice, and you have pediments, and you have these pieces of sculpture that rise above the roof of the building. So it's all around the building meeting the sky, the junction between building and sky. And if you look at the left-hand side of the building, where it comes to an end, it also changes. You can see that the gaps, the size of the arch, the little gaps on each side get smaller, it gets a bit tighter, and then you get a double column at the end instead of a single. So it's sort of, it's like a bookcase, isn't it? It's making a closure to the building. Now, if we look at a modern building, and this is the Monastery of La Tourette by Le Corbusier, it's quite interesting to look at it in the same kind of a way. And just get to where I am. And you can see that there's very little of the material joints, material junctions, because it's really sort of more or less all one material. When things come against each other, there's just a gap where a column hits the beam, it just hits it. So there's almost no material joint that you can pick up with from this distance anywhere. But it's, in a certain sense, I think, compensated for by a lot of what we looked at as formal joints. And in fact, I think there are 5 different kinds of opening. Instead of there just being windows in the building, there are 5 different kinds of openings in the windows, in the building. The ones on the top with the little balconies, the stripy ones that are just below that, the long slots with little ends of beams that are hanging out, and then the underside of the building where it simply opens out. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see there are 3 openings there which have got a kind of a shield outside it. So the sort of so the building's got almost no material junctions, but it's got a lot of formal ones. And the row of balconies on the top, for example, is also a formal junction between the building and the sky, just as the open underneath is the formal junction, again, where the building hits the ground. And if you look at the edges of the building, you have these cantilevers that stick out beyond the building that, in a way, end it. So when you experience that inside, you experience a whole lot of different kinds of openings, which gives it a certain richness and a variety, and which I think, in a certain sense, Corbusier was looking here to again get the same kind of degree of intensity of expression and experience as old buildings, but more cheaply, because it's a lot cheaper to do this than it is when you start making those beautiful moldings that we were looking at with Scarpa. I'm not saying at all that it couldn't do with some softer kind of detailing as well. I think it would definitely have been improved by having another level of what I would call like a fingertip detailing that would go through it. But nevertheless, I think it gives you an idea of what he was trying to do. We've already seen, I think it was in the third talk, how early modern architects separated buildings out into these abstract planes, and making joints with gaps, rather than with a series of intermediary elements like you see in the classical system. This is actually this is a detail from the Louvre facade. But again, whenever anything joins, things go on, whereas with the modern building, where things come together, there's an absence. So they're like quite big opposites. And Carlo Scarpa, again, who's a North Italian architect, he's explored this very, very fully and richly. We've looked previously at other projects or bits of them of his, and I think this is quite an interesting one to look at, because I think in this Castelvecchio museum, takes the idea of the joint being a space just about as far as it can go. So at the sort of overall level, where he had these ancient buildings that joined each other, the first thing he did was separate them, and he made a gap, which seems a fairly brutal thing to do as a piece of restoration, but it does mean that you see these things very much in relation to each other. And then if you're going to renovate one, which he was doing, turning it into a gallery, a contemporary gallery, so a lot of his own contemporary architectural design was going to be incorporated too, that he brings out into that same gap. So you see these three architectures completely separate from each other, all in the one space. So it's sort of, that's at the big scale. And then at every scale below that, he uses this same idea of where things come together into a junction. He uses this technique of separating one from the other, which clearly again locates it in time. So in the left-hand side, you can see that the walls in one direction are separated from the walls in the other. The walls are separated from the floors by this sort of slightly recessed gap. If you look on the right-hand side, every pedestal that these antique sculptures are put onto is raised off the ground as if it's floating. When he comes to put a new window into an old one, he keeps the details of it completely separate from each other. When there's a staircase comes down, the vertical wall again separates itself from the stairs, and then on the right-hand side, even the beams that he had to put in to stabilize the structure of this old building, you can see that the new steel beam that he puts in is separate from the ceiling and has these little stub columns, and where it goes through the wall, again, it goes through a kind of a recessed gap. So you get a kind of a pattern of being a way of making details that talks about a contemporary way of building. And even to the little steps down below, where the two left and right feet, if you like, of a little stair have that little gap around them that separates them from the thing that it hangs onto. Okay, the third idea then is that detail is what carries the meaning that relates to construction, which is an allusion to the construction stability of the building and its shelter. And I think it shows very well in Frank Lloyd Wright's famous Roby House, the role that the detail plays. Wright was aiming to make an architecture of democracy, connecting outwards spatially, respectful of and tied to the earth, and very local, so related to the wide horizontal spaces of the prairies. That's the sort of ethos of his house. And just look at the role that detail plays in talking about that. Along the base of the building, there's a double stone plinth that runs around, which creates this sort of thick band that ties it to the earth and emphasizes the horizontality of the earth, talks about foundation and about stability, and then all the sills and copings, which are merely functional elements to keep rain from the dampness going into the top of walls, are given this great emphasis, which again increases the sense of the horizontality and stability of the building. And the brickwork itself is designed with horizontal joints that are emphasized and vertical ones suppressed, so it adds to the horizontality and connection with the earth. And then the roof is given this very thin edge, which if you can imagine all the structure that you would need to hold up a big cantilever like that, he did use steel inside there, but even so, there's a terrific performance to get that edge of that roof be so refined so that it could again add to the feeling of shelter and of a closeness and spatial connection with the earth. Imagine if it had a great fat roof sticking out there, how different it would be. Another example of this kind of thing, of the building, the detail being used to talk about construction, is another building by Carlo Scarpa, the Brion Cemetery. And he's quite clearly here working to develop motifs that relate to concrete construction. So these walls are made with to allude. No, I'm trying to remember the terms that I use, not express, to draw attention to the pouring of concrete into molds made of shutterboards. So these motifs are really related to that process of construction, while they're also, I think, talking about the thickness of the concrete and its sturdiness, but doing it in a way that creates at the same time a kind of delicacy in the way that light hits those edges of the walls. And where it's used horizontally, it's again talking about that way of pouring concrete into molds with edges made of shutters, but it's clearly also talking about layers that there are in the earth, so that's that expression part of when I was talking about meaning. It starts to express the layers of the earth, which is obviously an important thing to do in a cemetery. So you can see that, in fact, as you move around the cemetery, you all the time get the sense of the layers that there are in the earth, even with the way that steps are made that go up from one level to another. You have that sense of the building of the building of the concrete building of the building, but also of the layers of the earth, and that's taken right to the inside of the main little chapel, where that idea of showing the thickness of the walls, but in a way that creates a great delicacy, I think is shown quite clearly in that picture. And even to where, with the main space that goes above the altar in the chapel, it's still using that kind of stepped concrete motif. Apart from his allusion to construction in all that, Scarpa is obviously also using details to order the building, to get it all into a whole that's comprehensible as a particular entity. And that's always been a major intention for architects. Order doesn't necessarily mean orderliness at all, but more like completeness and a coherence between the parts of something and the whole, or a thematic consistency, so that you have something that is understandable as a total entity. And I think the best example of this is the old classical orders. I seem to keep referring to the classical, but I think it is because it was such an extraordinary system. So you can see the classical orders were in fact constructional elements. You can see them along the top there. There are 5 there. They usually have just as a start the 3: the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, and they're composed of a base, a column, a capital, and then the entablature or cornice on the top of it. They each have got that same composition. That is what the order is. And we've seen how those come together into the Doric temple front. Now, it's called an order because it actually orders the building, and it's amazing how precise it is. For example, if you gave somebody with a Doric temple the width of one of the flutes, they could design the whole building from that. Because there are a particular number of flutes that go around a column, and if it's so big, it gives you a column that's so big. There's a particular relationship between the column diameter and the space between the columns. There's a particular relationship between the diameter of column and the height. And the height of the column, or the height of the capital, has got a very particular relationship with the height of the column. So now we're up to the entablature, right? So, we haven't said that with a typical Doric temple front, you would have 6 columns across the front. The Parthenon did 8, which was like a revolution, but it was basically we had to be 6. And it would be 6 in one direction, and the other side varied a bit, but maybe 13 was a good thing. So, okay, so now we've got the whole base of the building, and then you come to the entablature, and of course the entablature has got the height of the entablature, that's the big beam above the columns, has got a specific dimensional relationship with the capital and the column, and so to the pediment. So, I mean, in 2 minutes, we've designed a Greek temple. It's amazingly precise. It's like a mathematical formula, really, I think. And I think it's partly because of that precision of it and clarity of it that it ordered buildings for 2,500 years, if you think of it. So, I mean, not Jamie, but Sarah Bartman Hall up the hill there was, I think, designed in the 1930s, maybe 1935. They were working on this stuff in like 400 BC. So all of the architecture really comes out of that simple detail, the simple details of that column. So when Palladio comes to order this building, he uses those kind of rules to generate all its dimensions. And of course, he here is also working with the mathematical ratios that relate to music. So that's also a detail, if you like, that's getting it all ordered. But if we just look at it very quickly, he uses mathematics a lot. The 6 columns across the width, all the ratios that there are in there. Then the building divides in these 3 pieces again: the lower base, the middle piece, and the attic top. There are small pieces of detail that run right around the building. These pieces of moldings that run around the building at 2 intermediate levels. Then again at the eaves, which tie the whole building together as an entity. They call that concatenation, linking it all together in a chain so that it all holds together, ordering the building. And they're really very tiny little elements. They're only about this deep, that are doing that. They're small pieces of it. Take them out, and what are you left with? If you look at them in more detail, each one of themselves is also kind of handled mathematically. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. There are all these little ratios that run through all of them, and look at the way with the mouldings. I'm looking at the mouldings on the right-hand side, the way the heights vary as you go up up the moulding. And all those things are important. They're integral with the building. You can see them from quite a long way away from it. What would they be like? What would the building be like without them? Now I've done something that I shouldn't have done. There we are. Every element is worked in the same way, and as I've said to you before, it's also those details also relate to human details. So you can see with the drawing on the right, I think it's I can't remember his name now who did it, but you can see how the mouldings and the way they're distributed, they were looking to relate them to the human figure, so that so that the building would be reflective of the human form. And here you can. These are just showing how precisely these things wrap around at the base of the building. So you can see that on the left-hand photograph, there's 1, 2, 3 steps, and then a wide coping on that wall with a statue sitting on it. And look how the actual levels of the steps tie up exactly with that. So it's absolutely precisely put together again. Incredible precision. Alva Aalto was also a classicist and was trained as that. But and a lot of his buildings are actually also ordered to mathematical relationships. But it's obvious that in this building, which is the Sinat Salo Civic Centre, that there are also other things at work. A good part of its unity, or the sense of order that you experience, comes from it being built, obviously, with a limited number of materials. And a second unifying feature is the way that all the openings are made as a kind of little family with these strong vertical slats. And there are quite a lot of variants of these. As you can see, they double up sometimes, and sometimes they get bigger and smaller. But basically, there's a whole family of a way of making openings there, which clearly are metaphors of the trees, the forest, and you keep seeing the forest through them when you go inside. And they go right into the council chamber at the top, where the trees become more branch-like kind of elements. So that's one set of ordering elements that is being used through detail that runs right through the building. And the other one is the use of these little cantilevers, which refer to contemporary construction again. So you can see in all of these photographs that the building cantilevers a little bit beyond the end, almost wherever you look at, whether it's the stairs going up with a corner window in the top photo, and then these other elements where the building goes past the column, and others where walls don't go right up to the ceiling. So all the time it's talking again about a structure that is actually a reinforced concrete structure which holds up the roofs, and the walls are really much more like screens than things that are holding the building up. It's primarily in the detail that you read the character of a building, just as it is in people's faces. So you can see here with Piero's faces along the top that he obviously eliminated detail to quite a large extent and concentrated much more on the pure geometry of the figures in order to create a certain kind of eternal quality or something like that perhaps. Whereas Titian below, although there's a certain amount of idealization there too, I guess, you can quite clearly see that he's differentiating details one from the other. So the character of buildings works in the same kind of a way. So if you look at those buildings, they're roughly the same kind of buildings, South African houses, but they have different characters from the differences that there are in detail. And if one even thinks about the buildings we've been looking at, the brickwork that we've been looking at, the detail, how much difference there is in character between those buildings, simply coming out of the way that bricks are used. So I'm going to go through one building just to think about its character and its detail. This is the Nezu Museum, yes, of Kengo Kuma in Tokyo. And you can see as you approach it, he sets up this kind of very typical Japanese entrance journey where you go into a kind of emptiness that you're not quite sure where it's going to end, that they called Ma, a kind of live emptiness. And as a whole thing, it's sort of quite bold. It's a huge overhang and a very bold floor and so on. But then he's working with this very, very delicate details, and that's really his major concentration and exploration at the moment, is working with the very latest engineering. So you can see that the structural elements holding up the wide overhang are very thin. He emphasizes that by using natural bamboo as a facing in the wall. He makes the floor feel very thin and delicate by comparing it with a sort of rather rough pebbles along the side, and then the whole way that it balances with actual bamboo growing along the side and a very open fence. So the whole thing really is made to talk about and to create the character of a very particular kind of technology. And as you go through the building, this is where you come around the corner to the entrance, and again you can see how all these elements are made to feel very, very light and very delicate. And when you go inside, there's some sense of that sort of overreaching ceilings and roofs of old buildings, but it's all made in this very, very lightweight, delicate way. On the other side of the building, you can see again that it's very traditional. It's rather a poor photograph, the one on the left-hand side, which should show that it really it looks like at a glance, it looks like a simple traditional Japanese building built in a new way. But when you come closer to it, it gets so light and so delicate that it's almost it seems to be building that Japanese idea of a building being like nature, that it's something that could just blow away. And when you get to the restaurant out in the garden, it's so fragile that there's almost nothing there. So all of that character of the building comes out of the way that it's detailed and put together. As usual, I'm taking a bit longer than I hoped. I think I'm getting there. The last area is that through this detail, the architect takes you through sensory experience. And again, Alvar Aalto, I'm sure you've picked up that he's my favorite architect. And he has a hospital from 1928. I mean, it's a long time ago. And you come to a place where it's all rounded for a start. So you don't bump your elbow on anything. Where you go to the cashier's desk, it's nice and easy to touch. There's a lovely, friendly yellow color that he has. Light comes from down into it from above. Where you go up the stairs, you can see that it's an easy step, even from this distance, to walk up. And the round column next to it has got the slightly darker thing. So if you feel like hanging onto the corner as you go around, it's okay. You're not going to mess it up. And when you go up the stairs, it's got these beautiful rounded, wide treads. It's got a handrail that goes so beautifully around the corner. It's held up in a way that you're never going to catch your fingers on it. If you look at the light fittings in a hospital reflecting this lovely golden light, and Aalto with